Welcome to Nothing Else Is On, the show you're watching because nothing else is on. I'm Andrew. I am the Leawood campus pastor. Over here we got...
I'm Reed Capel. I am the Olathe campus pastor.
And to his left...
Due east.
Tim Spaber, Shawnee campus pastor.
And Tim's... Whose mic's not on?
So that's... I
Tim's?
think I win $20.
It's on now.
It's on now.
I'm Tim Spaber,
Can we go ahead...
Shawnee campus pastor.
Can we go ahead and keep Tim's mic off?
They've got the mute button on.
Is that okay?
It's actually a calculator. It's not really even a microphone. So
We're on, right? This is
we're on,
compelling.
but nothing else is.
All right, I'm going to look over here.
Do it.
If this is your first time joining us, I have to apologize. But maybe you don't know why we're doing this. So we, as 5 campuses at Christ Community, are walking through the book of Revelation on Sunday mornings. And we know that this is a really complicated book. It's really complex. We know we can't possibly get to every question or detail that we may want to cover or that people may want to ask. So we created this little space here on Facebook where we talk a little bit more about Revelation together, and we take in your questions. So hopefully right about now on the screen there is a text in number where you can start sending your questions in, and Reed will be getting those, so we'll be watching those live and responding as they come for the next few minutes or so.
So be nice.
So be nice, and I'm going to go back to all of us here together because I want to start us off with just a little icebreaker around Apocalypse and Revelation. Okay.
Good.
So what I did is I found what are, in my opinion, the top 3 worst end times predictions in history. Okay. So here's in reverse order. So this is number 3.
Okay. Third worst.
William Miller, a pastor in the 19th century, between 1831 and 1844, based on his study of the Bible, this pastor, who's a Baptist New York farmer, predicted and preached the return of Jesus Christ to earth on October 22nd, 1844.
Good for him.
Did it happen?
That day...
Don't ruin it.
That's
Don't
the
ruin
twist! That day came and went, and it was later known as the Great Disappointment. Interestingly, out of this movement, I believe it has roots, or the Seventh-day Adventist group has roots in this movement.
Oh.
But I just had to end on this. Here's Miller's quote from that day. I waited all Tuesday, and dear Jesus did not come. I waited all the forenoon of Wednesday, and was well in body as I ever was. This is serious, Reed.
I understand. Just forenoon, it's an
But
important
after
word.
12 o'clock, I began to feel faint, and before dark, I needed someone to help me up to my chamber. But I always feel that way after dark. As my natural strength was leaving me very fast, and I lay prostrate, I got that one, for 2 days without any pain, sick with disappointment.
That was actually going to be the name of this show, Sick with Disappointment.
Sick with disappointment. Someone write that down.
So that's
Right.
number 3.
That was
That's the great disappointment.
You guys, they only get better. Okay.
We're
warming up.
It lived up to its name.
All right,
the
number
Great
2.
We're
Disappointment.
warming up. You're gonna like this one.
Or not. Those are the options.
In 1806, a domesticated hen in Leeds, England, appeared to lay eggs inscribed with the message, Christ is coming.
On like the shell? I
On
guess?
the egg.
On the egg. The yolk? Get yolk?
Get yoked. Great numbers of people reportedly visited the hen. I'm going to get through this. And began to despair of the coming judgment day. It was soon discovered, however, that the eggs were not in fact prophetic messages, but the work of their owner, who'd been writing on the eggs in corrosive ink and reinserting them into the hen's body.
Oh my God.
So,
Oh god.
This is where Whole Foods actually gets all their eggs. Too. I don't know if you knew this.
It was free range.
This is actually the only way I eat eggs. is blasphemous inscribed eggs. All right, number 1.
any thoughts on? I mean, okay, yeah.
No, I think we're good. I think we're good.
So what he would do, he would write it on the egg, and then, yeah, okay. So number 1.
Point taken.
Number 1. In 2011, a local Pawnee, Indiana group known as the Reasonableists, also known as Zorpies, who follow Zorp the Surveyor, predicted that the end of the world was coming on May 19th of that year. But due to a scheduling conflict with the Parks and Rec department, the end of the world was postponed to May 20th.
To May 20th. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Now that was the Easter egg. That was not real.
And I take offense to that. So I'm wearing my Indiana hoodie now because I'm from Indiana. And Indiana, it seems like anytime there's a show about Indiana, there's a cult associated with it. Whether it's the Zorpies or in Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt, the John Wayne Gary Wayne.
Richard Wayne Gary Wayne.
There it is.
Reverend Richard Wayne Gary Wayne leads a cult of mole women.
And listen,
Yes.
to be clear, Indiana has lots of cults being started in its history. So it's right. If you're going to start a cult, Indiana is apparently a good place to try.
I love that you're saying that as if we're like, because that's our primary target audience, people interested in starting cults.
Who's out there on Facebook on Monday night? But if you're thinking,
live poll. Who here cares about Tim's offense at Indiana?
I get.
I have a great guess. All right, so that was our little icebreaker. Tim, you were going to walk us through, you're going to take an image in Revelation and walk us through maybe a case study on how to use the imagery of Revelation to understand the rest of the book. So let's turn it on. Let's.
we're out of the Zorpies. We're into Revelation. Okay, so last Sunday, I think a lot of the campuses were at in Revelation 12 and 13, or hopefully all of us were.
I think so. I think we can assume that.
That's the idea.
That's the model. That's the model.
We're preaching Revelation?
So in Revelation 11 through 13, there's an image that gets introduced and used pretty frequently. So it's a time period of 3.5 years. So in Revelation 11:2, it's 42 months. In Revelation 11:3, it's 1,260 days. In 12:6, it's 1,260 days. And then it's time times and half a time in 12:14, and 13:5, it's 42 months. So there's this common theme of this time frame used throughout Revelation 11 through 13. So I think it could actually.
And each of those is 3.5 years,
3.5
right?
years,
Yes.
In different denominations.
If you do the math,
right.
it's 3.5
That's why we
years.
gave you a calculator instead of a
I'm
microphone.
trying to keep up with you.
yes.
Yeah, keep going.
So the question becomes, okay, so what is this time period referring to? And I think 12 begins to actually show, again, a phrase we used, Revelation is meditation literature, which is when you read it for the first time, you're typically not going to get all of the symbols and images because they're going to be made more clear the more you read the book. So in Revelation 12, I think that 3.5 year time period becomes clearer. So we get in verse 5, so there's three images or three people in Revelation 12. There's the woman, the son, and the dragon. We're told the dragon is Satan, the son is Jesus, and the woman we'll get to in a second. That's a little bit of a less clear image. So the son is taken up, Jesus is taken up to God and to his throne, and then the woman fled into the wilderness where she has a place prepared by God in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. So a number of commentators point out, well, here now we have a pretty clear entry point into when this 3.5 year time period began, which is the Son is caught up to God in his throne, which is a reference to Jesus' death, burial, resurrection, and ascension to the right hand of God, which has been a really important theme through Revelation. And then as that happens, or right after that happens, the woman flees into the wilderness where she's to be nourished for 1,260 days. So most commentators, or at least my reading of this would be, there's the ascension of Jesus, and then the woman flees into the wilderness, and that begins the 1,260 days. Now, people who would take a more futurist reading of Revelation would say there's a gap between the ascension of Christ and then the woman fleeing, beginning the 1,260 days. That this 3.5 year time period is yet future.
Right.
I think
probably more literal 3.5 years.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's putting a gap between verse 5 and 6, I think is reading something in there that's not there. And also this imagery of who is the woman, and I preached on that on Sunday. But I would take that as a reference as the people of God throughout history. So the beginning half of Revelation 12, it's Israel giving birth to the Messiah, who's caught up. And then post-Messiah, it's the people of God, it's the church, who now are fleeing, they're now experiencing a wilderness existence while the devil makes war on them. But to back up, so what is this 3.5 year time period? And as I mentioned, I think it was last week, anytime there's an image, the first question we should ask is that in the Hebrew Bible somewhere?
Yeah.
Second question is, well, is it a reference to maybe something in that day, in the first century Revelation, before we say, is that something maybe for us that we would understand? And that 3.5 year time period is really central to Daniel and to Elijah's ministry. So the 3.5 year time period is mentioned in Daniel 7 and Daniel 9 as a reference to an end times type attack on the temple of God.
In Jerusalem.
Yeah, so the initial fulfillment of that was most likely Antiochus Epiphanes when he sacrificed.
You nailed that.
I
Good
did.
job. Good
I tried to do it in
job.
practice.
We've been
Antiochus
practicing since 4 o'clock.
Epiphanes. He sacrificed a pig. It's the abomination of desolation. That's sort of an initial fulfillment of that 3.5 year period. But now Revelation is saying there's yet another 3.5 year time period that's being referred to. But the key piece of Daniel being the people of God in that time period are attacked and the temple is under assault in this end time period. The other 3.5 year time reference is to Elijah's ministry, which Jesus refers to in Luke 4, and then James also picks up, that Elijah had a 3.5 year ministry in the wilderness, under constant threat and assault by people who opposed him, who opposed the truth he was speaking as prophet. And so now these two images set us up for what Revelation is referring to, which is the common themes are God's people are opposed, God's people are his true people are in the wilderness, and that begins to set the framework for then how we understand the 3.5 year time period. So if verse 6 is right, and it begins right at the ascension of Christ, this 3.5 year time period begins, then I would take that to be a metaphor, not a literal 3.5 year time period, but a
kind of time, not a length of time, but a
yes.
kind of time.
And some people will say that's true, and then also there will be a 3.5 year intensification of all of these themes at the end of times as well. So there's a figurative kind of, this is the church age of a time of being in the wilderness, nourished by God. And then there's others say, and then that's all going to culminate in a final 3.5 year time period right before the return of Christ. So in verse 6, if the 3.5 year time period begins, and that's explaining the church age, then that gives us some framework for how to understand our time of ministry as a church, which is we're in the wilderness, so the world is not our home. We're told in verse 14 of chapter 12 that we're to be nourished for times and a half time, and then the devil makes war against the woman. So we're in a time period of having a war made against us by the dragon, by the devil.
As we're being nourished, like simultaneously.
Yes, right,
Yeah.
it's both. And then in verse 5 of chapter 13, one of the sea beast that rises out is allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. So there's this time where, despite the fact that the accuser, the dragon, has been thrown out of heaven, he has some bit of authority on earth through the beast, through his pursuit of the woman to make war on her. And so therefore there's this tension of the church is the people of God being nourished in the wilderness while satanic forces are allowed to make war on it in the world. And when you begin to take now that 3.5 year time period and read it back into 11 verses through or chapter 11 through 13, it makes sense of a lot of images, which we don't have necessarily time to get into all of those. But in particular, the one place I will go in verse 11 that I think combines all of the, or chapter 11, that combines all of these things is we're told that God will grant his authority to his two witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days clothed in sackcloth.
That's verse 3.
Yes.
Verse 3.
And we pointed out that we think the two witnesses are a reference to the church general and our witness. And so now you get a sense of, okay, well, if the church witness began at the ascension of Christ, that's when the 1,260 days began. That now tracks with verse 3 of chapter 11, the 3.5 years of the two witnesses beginning their ministry. That's the same time frame, as well as in verses 1 and 2, God tells John, or the angel tells John, to measure the temple, which is a metaphor for the church, the presence of God, which tracks with Daniel's 7 and 9 use of the 3.5 year time period, where God's temple is going to be assaulted. But now, instead of a physical building being assaulted,
It's a people.
It's the people.
it's a people. So all of these images now that you've been through, okay, what is this 3.5 year time period? What is this? After you've read through all of chapter 11 and 12 in particular, now some of those things become more more clear about, this is the 3.5 year time period began with the ascension of Christ. It lasts the entirety of the ministry of the church. And then when you get to the end of chapter 14, the final judgment and the beast is destroyed, the dragon is destroyed, that's the end of the 3.5 year time period. So again, that's my reading. A number of people would say, no, the 3.5 years is off in the future. Some would say the 3.5 years was right after Christ was ascended, and that's referring to the first century assault from Rome on Jerusalem. And there's really good reasons to see the 3.5 year time period in that way. But I think what makes most sense of 11, 12, and 13 is when you see that we are living in the 3.5 year time period now. The church is being assaulted by the world, the dragon, and we're called to bear witness in the midst of that, nourished by God in the wilderness, much like Elijah and much like Daniel prophesied an assault on the temple in the first century. God's people will continually get an assault from the world. So it's pretty dense stuff, but that's the 3.5 year time period.
Yeah, if there were a way to talk about Revelation non-dense, please text that in. Text it in now. How to do that. And I really like that, Tim, just even helping us to take the imagery seriously. And I think when I do that, I get intimidated by the imagery, and it kind of is like, oh, forget it. But when you put the work in and you begin to make connections across different books of the Bible, it really does unlock so much more meaning in this book. And in some ways seems to be part of what John's trying to teach us to do, is to go back and reread other parts of the Bible to make sense of what he's saying. Okay, so any questions we got coming in that we can talk about?
Yeah, we have a couple here. Let's see here. So one was, is COVID-19 going to last 3.5 years? That's one question. So is that what the 3.5 years?
See, we're 6 months.
Is in reference to?
Are we? No, we're 60 years in at this point.
I think so, roughly. In COVID years. So this is
No
one.
more cynical questions, guys.
So I don't know.
Get it together.
I don't know if this is a cynical question, but I actually think it's a worthwhile one. How many times and do you have to read Revelation to understand it? Is it 3.5 times? But maybe that's a kind of a practical question of like, what are ways? I mean, Tim, you've talked about how Revelation is meditation literature. Andrew, you were just mentioning how Revelation's designed to help us look back at all of Scripture and piece these pieces together. But yeah, what is there a way to even try to even answer that question in a practical way? How many times do we read Revelation to understand it?
One more time.
One more time.
You're one time away. Next time.
I almost feel like you could say this about all of God's Word, that you will always learn something new when you open this book. And I believe part of that is the beauty of it as literature. I mean, it is incredible. It's an incredible piece of literature, just in and of itself. But I think also it's because the Holy Spirit is never done revealing to His people insight and truth from His Word. So but I would even say, I've read Revelation a lot, even in my studies, and I think he'd be okay with me sharing this. Even Tom has mentioned how much his view of Revelation has changed over time, and he's a really sharp dude. So I just think it's one of those. It is in particular one of those books that illustrates this point, that you can't read it enough, and you're always going to learn or see something new.
Yeah, and it's going to uniquely not just unlock truths found within the book itself, but help unlock things throughout Scripture. So even when you were just speaking, Tim, like it made me think of, okay, wilderness, that's a time of both danger and protection. And it's just like, well, that's the historic people of God. That's also the person of Jesus, his temptation in the wilderness. He is dealing with temptation, and then it ends by saying he is nourished, ministered to by the angels. And so it's another way that Revelation is trying to point us even to the person of Jesus uniquely.
Yeah, and to add to that, so even an image as simple as in verse 14 in chapter 12, but the woman was given 2 wings of the great eagle so that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness. The theme of mounting up on eagle's wings out of the wilderness and exile into salvation that's all over the Hebrew Bible, but Isaiah 40 in particular is my favorite, where Isaiah the prophet writes, Even youth shall be faint and weary, young men shall fall exalted, but they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. So now here, even in just like a, I shouldn't call it a throwaway verse, but just like a random reference.
Yeah,
Now
but
it's
one we might easily read over.
Yeah.
go back and meditate on Isaiah 40. Or our women's ministry team has had like a cool little Bible reading program along with Revelation. They're reading through Daniel. And in the midst of reading through Daniel, like I brought out some stuff from the book of Zechariah, which had helped them in kind of their own reading plan. And I've never really studied the book of Zechariah. And yet the lampstand imagery, the four horsemen, the two olive trees mentioned in Revelation 11, all of that comes from Zechariah, and it's like, well, now I need to go back and read Zechariah and spend months there just studying, meditating, and then come back to Revelation. So in one sense, I think and even telling people in our campus this, my hope is after this series, like you can read it, Revelation now in a way, and a fruitfulness that you couldn't before.
You can build on this.
Yes,
Yeah.
and yet there's really, I think this book in particular, there's really no end to meditating on these images and what they mean, because there are so many little moments that refer back, that you just now go meditate on this scripture, because it's not just that eagle's wings are cool, but actually there's some pretty deep connections between what's being said here in Revelation 12:4 and what's being said in Isaiah 40. That you can only get when you've done the work of meditating on both passages. So in one sense, we hope when you read Revelation now, it's like, okay, I really understand more. In another sense, you can be at this for the rest of your life and mining out the beauty of God's word. So
That's great.
Do you think anyone's ever read that passage and their only takeaway was eagle's wings are cool? Is that?
I mean, that's how I read it initially. It was like, this was
Well, and to make your point too, just last thought, while you were speaking, I was wondering, even just who's in the room, what would it be like to read Revelation with someone in a persecuted context? Because right now, we're three people in the modern West, and our experience is very different. It's still relevant, but it's so different than another context. What would it be like to sit down and look at this imagery with someone who's coming from a different culture? What would that unlock? I mean, this feels like one of those books that would be really fruitful to do that kind of in a community internationally.
Yeah. There's a sense in which maybe like living in a time of comfort or ease, the book of Revelation is just going to be confusing and irrelevant to us. But in a situation where there is great persecution, where we're feeling acutely life in the wilderness, Revelation becomes all the more real, relevant, and necessary in making sense of our current moment.
I think what's important too, when you read the scripture, you focus in on images like this, like an eagle, and you don't take the eggs from your hen.
I knew you were going somehow back
I
to
just
the
can't
hen.
get over that, man. He wrote. Anyway, go ahead. Keep us going.
Well, so here's a question I think would be helpful to consider as we're talking about symbols, and we've been doing this quite a bit in the series of, hey, these symbols are not just referring to events that have happened or events that will happen or events that are happening. It's kind of everything. But do these symbols have any kind of ultimate reality? And so as we think about the dragon, the beasts, as we think about, take your pick. And so while there is a repeating pattern of, let's say, the beast in particular throughout time, is there a final beast? And I know there's dangers on trying to be on the lookout, or is this the beast? How do we interpret these moments? And is this the end times? There can be danger to that, or there should be caution to it. But is there a final beast when we think about these symbols?
So you're making us we finally have to answer, or at least I finally have to answer, because I probably am on the minority side of Christ Community staff. So when I read Revelation, I don't ultimately think that a lot of these have so Revelation 13, the beast of the land. I don't see that as one final empire that this is ultimately referring to. What I think Revelation 13 is saying is that, it's the first beast rises out of the sea. Satan, the dragon, transfers his authority to this beast. I think that's a sign of a number of different imperial state powers that will use the authority the dragon gives them to persecute the church. And a lot of people reading Revelation would say, and there's going to be a final, ultimate kingdom that Revelation 13 is referring to. And I'm certainly open to that, but I think how I would read Revelation is, actually, this is a message that essentially every state imperial power that will ever exist, Satan will try to use that power to persecute his church, which means our posture towards the state is one of caution and awareness. And so therefore it's for every Christian throughout all time in history, rather than just saying, look out for one final beast at the end. It's actually the culture and state you live under can become the beast. And to both to oppress you, but also to try to get you to compromise your witness and join the state power against the way of Jesus. So that's how I would probably lean no on that. And I know I might be in the minority on
No,
the
that,
way they
Is
say
that because you're from Indiana?
Well, that's, I
Or
mean,
is that just a coincidence?
that's the cult factor.
our robust history of cults. That's why I land there.
Reed, I kind of want to hear your answer to this, and then I can go last, and you can keep looking at questions.
Yeah, I would say my tendency is I would align with Tim mostly in saying, yeah, I think it's probably more important to think about how we see the manifestation of the beast in particular as made manifest in political, economic, military powers that aren't necessarily all like completely top to bottom antithetical to Jesus. That's part of the allure, is that they draw us into thinking, no, this could be a goodness. And so I think the primary posture is to be on the lookout of how there are beastly powers that have a Babylonian accent, if you will, that they're never fully aligned with the mission of Jesus, but they can tempt us to think they are. In terms of like a final authority, I mean, I would say I lean towards not seeing that, but I am open to that idea of an ultimate beast of manifestation. But I think when I think of Jesus' words in terms to his disciples about, hey, when about the end times, this is not what you need to be concerned about. And so I take that to be, look, you need to be on the lookout now. Live with sober judgment. Be mindful, be watchful and attentive. And I don't think that means that there won't be an ultimate manifestation of these symbols. But I see even Jesus' instructions to his people to be on guard now. Be attentive, be alert, be sober-minded. And so I think, maybe we're more aligned than I care to admit, actually, Tim. But I think that's probably how I would approach it. And maybe we're not aligned. You're just moving further away from me. But that's kind of how I would attempt to approach that. So I'm open to the idea of it, but I'm less convinced of that idea of an ultimate beast at the end.
Yeah. So we've talked about. It's probably helpful to that the three primary ways you can read Revelation are. It's a past document. It's only talking about things that have already happened. It's an ideal document, which is kind of this technical term for it's just kind of always true. It's imagery. It's kind of how we've predominantly been preaching it. It's
you can open in any generation and time.
It's relevant at any time. Yeah. Isn't necessarily predicting what's going to happen, but is helping equip in the present moment, which I think is really where you want to put your most of your weight when you're reading the book of Revelation. However, there's the third way, which is the futurist reading, which is that it does anticipate and prepare the Christian community for the moments before the final judgment, or rather, I should say, before the return of Christ. And yeah, I think I have that a little futurist in me, that these images, while they are relevant for all ages, I think will find a culmination in kind of this penultimate moment before Jesus comes back. Like, I do think there's going to be an ultimate
empire or something
beast, but with this caveat that I'm extremely skeptical that we would ever have the wisdom to know what only God can know. Because that moment could be right now, and probably none of us are sitting here thinking, this is it. I mean, there are probably some people who are, but there always are.
Yeah.
So so kind of for all practical purposes, I think I apply it as an idealist. Like, this could be the moment, and you've got to treat it that way in a wise, loving, caring way. Like, you've got to be ready, which seems to be Jesus' main focus when he teaches about the end, which is not about predicting, but about watchfulness now, because it could happen at any time. Yeah. So pastorally, that's usually my focus, is let's be discerning right now, which is where you guys are too. But I think I'm probably more futurist, kind of idealist futurist at the same time when it comes to some of these images, especially when you get to these later chapters in Revelation before the return of Christ. So we're gonna the millennium's coming up, and let's not do questions on that because we're gonna
Yeah.
preach on that
Yeah.
section later. But things like that I would take more literally and futuristic.
Okay, how about this one? What is the reference of Michael's war against the dragon? So that seems kind of, that brings to mind for me images of the great Christian artist Carmen and his don't do any research on Carmen, but what is that referring to? Is that a real event in history and time? Is it metaphorical? If it is, what's it referring to? And so I'd love to hear thoughts on Michael, the angel, and the dragon.
I feel really open to lots of different ways to read that part of Revelation. I tend to think of it primarily as just, and again, really based on the imagery given, that this is a reference to the birth of Christ. So it's this moment where Satan knows his defeat is coming because Messiah has come and he's going to defeat Satan. And that is, John is referencing that in the vision of Satan being cast from heaven. And I'm compelled by that because it certainly has to do with the revelation of Christ. It certainly has, this child is Christ, so it's something to do with him and his incarnation. I think that's really clear. Why I think it is in particular his birth is that John in his vision sees a woman giving birth. I think that's just really, he's tying this all back to the promised child that is really a theme that runs all throughout Scripture that culminates in Jesus, the promised son, the seed of the woman who's going to crush the head of, and that battle begins in earnest at his birth. And you really see even Satan's violence in the genocide that takes place to kill him.
Right.
I mean, I think there's a direct correlation between. So that's how I would read that part. But there's a lot of different ways people look at it.
Yeah, and even how I read verses 1 through 12 in chapter 12 of Revelation is verses 1 through 6 is sort of the earthly view of what's happening. So the woman who is Israel gives birth to the Messiah, Jesus, and as she gives birth, Satan is right there to try to destroy the child. And you see that a number of different ways in the Gospels. Andrew mentioned the genocide. I would put the wilderness temptation of Jesus in there. He's trying to get Jesus off mission. Even that little interesting moment where Jesus informs the disciples he has to go to the cross, and Peter says, "No, you don't have to do that. Like let's go to." And Jesus' response to Peter is, "Get behind me, Satan."
He talks to someone else in that moment.
There's more than just Peter in the room. And so
that's good. I never thought about that.
So he then you get to the end. He's trying to destroy the child, but he doesn't. And so she gives birth to a male child, one who's to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. That's Psalm 2, a reference to Jesus. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, which we read. And then verse 7, I think, is going back to the beginning, what Andrew mentioned, that when Jesus is born, that's when the battle gets intense. And so now you get the heavenly reality of what's going on earth. So on earth, there's Jesus is in the being tempted in the wilderness. Herod's slaughtering the babies. What's happening in heaven is Michael and the angels are warring against one another, and then Satan is defeated. And the question becomes, what is his moment of defeat? And I've read that as that's the crucifixion and an installation of Jesus as king. And the reason I read it that way is verse 11, when we're told that the saints in Jesus, have conquered the dragon, Satan, by the blood of the Lamb. And the line of the Lamb image from Revelation 4 and 5, why Jesus is worthy to open the scrolls, all culminates in Jesus' death, burial, resurrection, and ascension, which is then what casts Satan out of heaven. But that doesn't mean that history ends, right? It's now what's happened is Satan's been thrown down to earth, and he's making war against the church. And
in a sense, then both Christ's activity on the earth intensifies through the church age, and so does Satan's activity in response to that. That makes sense.
And even I think what's most important, probably, or maybe not, but what's important for us is that to every earthly reality that's going on, there's a heavenly reality that corresponds to that. And of course, that's what Ephesians 6 says. Paul says you're not warring against flesh and blood, but against the principalities, powers. There's a heavenly reality that corresponds to the earthly reality, and even interestingly, Michael is mentioned first in Daniel as sort of. He sort of comes off as the representative angel of Israel, of God's people, and so there's some who would make the case, and those some would be me included in that.
There are some.
That Michael actually is the representative angel for the people of God, which is why he's fronted here. He is the woman's angel, so to speak,
Yeah,
he is the heavenly corresponding reality, which, even going back to Revelation 1 and 2, when the letters addressed to the 7 churches are addressed to the angels of the 7 churches, their heavenly reality corresponds to an earthly reality. I think you're getting a little bit more of that glimpse here with Michael fighting on behalf of God's people against the dragon, and ultimately Christ slaying the dragon through his death and burial and resurrection.
How long are we supposed to go on this?
I think a day and a half. Three.
Like
I think it's three.
Like we should
time and then time.
About 10 minutes ago.
We're in the times.
How many more? How many more questions do we want to do?
Let's do at least one more, and then we'll have kind of our closing question,
Okay,
if that's
okay.
cool. So how about this? So this is to this point of kind of heavenly realities, spiritual realities behind our observable empirical realities that we live in. How serious should we take accounts of people who claim to have encountered the demonic? And so we think about, we live in a world, we sang the song, A Mighty Fortress, and, that we live in a world with devils filled, which sounds so like fanciful and implausible. And yet we do believe that this world simultaneously is charged with the grandeur of God and yet plagued with the presence of the devil. But at the same time, if someone comes up to you, Tim, and is just like, I just encountered someone who was possessed by a demon, and I cast it out. Like, wasn't that cool? Like, yeah, that's great. How do you respond to that? How serious do we take these accounts?
Well, I mean, given that I'm from Indiana, the land of colts, I might be the wrong person. No, so I think first we have to name, we live in a Western secular culture that denies almost anything supernatural, right? We're scared, we have an explanation for everything from a scientific standpoint, and that's good. I don't want to totally dismiss that. And so I would say two things to that. One is there is a reality that we cannot see, and that we are the most likely people in the history of the world. We're actually only one of the few people who would dismiss it the way we do, right?
Like so, currently, even in
throughout the world.
Yeah, right, right.
You go to most of the world, and they would not be dismissive of these things in the way that we are. And so there's the saying, there's not a devil behind every bush, which is true, right? But I think we have a tendency to...
Every other bush? Maybe?
Have you checked every bush? I mean, do we know?
And so every other bush. I don't think we take this reality seriously enough. But the second thing I would probably say that's more importantly is what demonic activity is described as in Revelation is actually... That's phenomena we're always around. So Satan is described primarily as the deceiver and as the accuser. So anytime someone is in a self-spiraling shame, accusation, space like that, that's demonic ultimately. When someone you're talking to someone and they're just not, you cannot get reality across to them, right? You're saying there's something that's just obviously true, but they cannot get in touch with that. There's deception, there's self-deception, or just deception by other forces, and then even to talk about the beasts and the imperial oppression against the church by state power. So again, Revelation 13, the sea beast is the political powers of the day that are oppressing God's people. That's happening now, all over the world. And what the church, or what Revelation would encourage us to see in that is not just bad politics, but actually demonic activity, taking state powers, military powers, and turning it against the church. So maybe, someone says, hey, I'm demon possessed, or I had this encounter. I think Christians in the West are far too skeptical of those things initially. And I think that leaves us often without an ability to actually fight the spiritual warfare. Revelation ultimately, where we're going, is we are called to take up arms with the Lamb. And I think we are too dismissive of these things. We should be discerning, certainly. But there is a supernatural reality that we don't see.
And if we don't see it, we're more susceptible to the threats and the attacks of our accuser and his deceptive words. Yeah. What would you say, Andrew? Anything you'd add?
No, I think that's a really good summary. Probably the only other thing I would add is that you could almost describe Satan's primary activity in the world. And again, this is a Westerner, but I think I'm stealing this from C.S. Lewis, from Screwtape Letters, where he's writing from the perspective of an accuser, of a tempter. And I think Screwtape says something to the effect of, hey, listen, like when we can distract people with our presence, that's great. But what we're really after is disinformation. Because it's way more potent, it's way more powerful. And I want, especially right now for the Christian church, I do think we need our antenna up for demonic activity. And I think it looks a lot like division, caused from disagreements that should not divide us, and from opinions and stances that should not be eroding at our community. And I don't know if we're being as attentive there as we could or should be. I think that's happening in our culture too. And I always have to, I think I said this on Sunday, and I always have to remind myself this, that on any given question or issue, right, we tend to think there are two sides. Satan's goal isn't necessarily to get you to pick a side. It's to distract you from Jesus. So whether you're right or wrong, Satan does not care. That may be part of what he's doing, but a win for him is to get us to divide and hate each other regardless of what the objective reality is. And I just feel the need to say that now as a reminder, even to myself, that's one of the primary ways our enemy works, even in Scripture, is lying and tearing us apart. So, but all that to say, I do think even just that statement, I don't think as Westerners we have that category for like what Twitter's doing. Like who's working on Twitter right now? Is it just algorithms and users? No, there's I'm like, no, there's actually spiritual entities in and through people that are creating a system of chaos and disruption and division. In those systems.
That's actually a great example because it's like.
Hang on, I gotta tweet that.
but Twitter's a great example because you can't point to Twitter and be like, okay, who's the person behind this that's creating all of this division and perpetuating misinformation? But it's something that has been created by a collection of people who aren't intending to spread misinformation or deceive people or cause division.
And even though there are state actors, we know there are state actors involved in that disinformation. Who's talking to them? It's like who's the puppet master? And I do think there are principalities and powers that we don't take seriously. And our imagination goes to The Exorcist. And it jumps through all the realities that we're in where I think Satan is definitely at work. And we should be discerning and praying and putting on the armor of God.
And avoiding the state of Indiana. I think mostly that's really,
That's why I left.
Okay, so last question. This is where I just want us to get a little bit practical as we think about, okay.
We love you, Indiana.
We do, the whole state.
Half my family lives there.
Because you had to say that.
Pull it down, delete it.
So, and this is kind of tied to what we just spoke about, but just to kind of get pastoral as we think about where our people are going to be spending their time tomorrow, how do these truths impact our lives on a daily basis? So the devil's described as the deceiver of the world, the accuser of our brothers and sisters. And so how should we respond to the many accusations we face on a daily basis that are either self-imposed or that come outside? How do we face those accusations, recognizing one, that they're from the deceiver of the world, but what is the remedy to facing those accusations, to kind of guard against them destroying us, unmaking us, and leading us to destroy and unmake others?
Yeah, to build on what Andrew said, oftentimes I think we think, oh, there's a right and there's a wrong. And that's where the battleground is. And it's true, right? Deception is a part of this. But I think what grieves me in this time is the way in which, depending on what side you are on an issue, it then devolves into accusation. Right? It's not just, hey, you're wrong, and we disagree, and we have good faith disagreement. It's hey, you are evil, or you are X, Y, Z. And listen, this can happen as something as small as an interpersonal disagreement at work, right? Like, well, I wanted to go this way, you want to go this way. Therefore you're evil. Or to really, we're in the midst of an election season. We're debating really important things that really matter. And what grieves me is when that moves into a space of accusation, refusing to see the good. And I use this on Sunday. So those of you who are Shawnee, you already heard this. To me, what accusation is...
they're not watching this.
I really like this illustration. It's of dogs, right? Like they're wonderful, they're beautiful, until you start petting them, and then they roll over, and then they expose their belly because they want you to pet it. And I think dog bellies are disgusting.
They are, rightly so.
It's
Yep.
like, well, you know, what
Checks
happened?
out.
It's like, what happened to the hair? It's what is that? It's
We get
gross.
it, Tim. Yeah, we get it.
And what
I think we got a picture. We can show,
what accusation is like
Put that hand
taking
back up.
the worst, most disgusting part of something, an issue, or another person, and just like offering that out to the world, to other people, or just that's the way you see that person. And what's so clear about Revelation 12 is that spirit, one, is satanic, and two, got kicked out of heaven. Right? I mean, that's Satan got thrown out of heaven because God hates that. And my hope is that Christians will begin to hate accusation in the way God does, in the way we frame people in such a negative way that it no longer becomes a disagreement but an accusation. So that's how I would speak.
That's good. I'll quickly say I kind of go to Jesus' temptation in the wilderness, and so in that temptation, what Satan was attempting to do was to get Jesus to really believe that he was a different kind of son than who God declared him to be. He wasn't just trying to get him to avoid his mission. He was doing that for sure, but he was trying to say, like, no, you're the kind of child who is entitled. You deserve to demand from your father these things, or you deserve to use your status to make much of yourself. And that's our tactic. That's the tactic of our enemy from the beginning. He's a one-trick pony. He's trying to get the people of God to doubt the kind of children that we've been declared to be. And so for me, the best remedy to battling the accusations of our deceiver is, and it sounds simple, but it's just like we have to daily declare to ourselves our identity as dearly beloved children. We are adopted into the family of God. And as you think about, like, if you think of a child who's maybe been adopted later in life, like, it's hard to probably embrace the reality of, like, I'm a part of this family. I have to be reminded of that. I had a friend who told me the story of they had a child who they had adopted later in life, and he could not sleep in his own bed. He had to keep sleeping on the floor because he was so used to sleeping on the floor in the conditions he was in. He couldn't even embrace the fact that he was in a family that he could sleep in a bed. And he had to be reminded day after day, you are a child of this family. This is your home. And so I would say is that we have to regularly declare to ourselves what God declares to us definitively, that we are his dearly beloved children. And as cheesy and Sunday school answer as that is, we never move beyond that. And if that's what our enemy is using to tempt us with and destroy us, then man, it means that we have to remind ourselves of that truth on a regular basis.
I think, Tim, in your sermon on Sunday, I was snooping around the church and I found your manuscript like an hour ago. And you had a line in there that said, the accuser's been thrown out of heaven, which means the statement, I'm no good, God doesn't love me, God doesn't want to talk to me, it's been thrown out of heaven. And I think that's as good a note to end on. So that statement has been thrown out of heaven, and we should actively throw it out of our own hearts and minds and combat it when we see it in one another.
It has no power.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's a good spot to end. Good conversation. Hopefully this was somewhat helpful to you. We will be back here next week at 8 o'clock on November 1st. So that is the night before the election. So I think we're going to get some good questions. So we hope that
November
you check
2nd.
Oh, sorry, November 2nd.
It's all right. We'll get you a calendar.
I'm on Sundays. That's just how my brain works. So November 2nd. We'll be back here on Monday night. We hope to see you there. Until then, have a great week, and we'll see you on Sunday.